Hello, everybody. We should hopefully be live now on youtube.com and on Facebook for our meeting discussing the coronavirus and the response of the British government. I'm not actually sure if we are in fact live.
Comrade, apparently we are. I can see our faces on the Facebook live stream.
Okay, excellent. Then we're probably live. So
So,
thanks for tuning
thanks.
in today, everyone. So tonight we're going to be hearing from Seamus, who is a regular contributor to Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, which is the paper of the Revolutionary Communist Group. And yeah, we're going to be, so the format is going to be a talk from Seamus for about half an hour, and then we will have a little bit of a Q&A. So if you've got any thoughts, anything you want to raise, just pop it in the comments and I will be reading some of those out. And this is just a quick reminder that you can please like and share what you're watching so you can help us get these revolutionary politics out to as many people as possible. So now I'm going to hand over to Seamus.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. So obviously Matt will be keeping an eye out for people's questions and any tech issues and stuff while I speak. So great. I will just start by saying hello. I hope we're all getting adapted to this online world. I know I'm finding it quite difficult. I'm going to talk today. I'm just going to start by asking a little something about the situation we're in. So, the last I checked, which was earlier today, the UK has 30,000 cases of the coronavirus, of the disease, and, the confirmed infections, and 2,500 deaths. We're getting increasing numbers of reports in the media that NHS workers are being gagged from speaking out about the lack of personal protective equipment and other problems in the NHS. There's barely any testing going on, no contact tracing, and a chronic lack of ventilators, all in the fifth, sixth, or seventh richest country in the world, depending on which statistics you want to use. And so the question kind of presents itself: how have we got ourselves into this situation? Why has the government not put the needs of the population first? And why has the government's response lagged so far behind the responses of China, South Korea, Germany, and importantly, as I'll talk about towards the end, socialist Cuba? And finally, I will address: what does it mean for British and world capitalism? And what does it mean for the working class in Britain and around the world? So, if we start by talking about the virus and the disease itself, so SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus, is a particularly virulent or infectious strain, and the disease it causes, COVID-19, has a particularly high case fatality rate when compared to other coronaviruses, i.e., other strains of the viruses in the kind of flu family. And this means that any effective public health response requires a number of key things. Firstly, mass testing and contact tracing of those who are confirmed to be infected. Secondly, isolation or quarantine of those suspected of having come into contact with the virus. Thirdly, large scale social distancing, which will severely limit the amount of contact between people and thus limiting the virus's exponential spread. And finally, economic measures that are put into place, social measures that are put into place to make these things actually possible. So, some kind of economic security so that people actually can practice social distancing. And this public health challenge puts governments all around the world in a bit of a quandary. So if Matt, if you could go to the slides, please. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. If you go to the next slide, should be one. Okay, no, that's fine. Go back to the last one, actually. I haven't got to that part. So governments all around the world are put into something of a quandary by this. The kind of decisive and effective public health response that I've just spoken about would require shutting down production, withdrawing workers from employment, shutting down retail and lots of kinds of consumption, and stopping consumers from spending. And that is what we're seeing. And what it's going to mean in a capitalist environment is that millions of people will be and already are being laid off from work because they are no longer going to be able to be put to work producing things profitably. Capitalists aren't going to be able to make a profit out of employing people. And capitalists are not in the business of paying workers just for the sake of it. And all this is going to have enormous economic consequences. So if Matt, if you could go to the next slide, please. So this here is according to OECD statistics. So they're official bourgeois statistics. They have their limitations. They're possibly quite conservative, and we should take what I'm about to say with a kind of statistical grain of salt. It's a kind of statistical exercise. But according to the OECD, each month of lockdown will lead to a contraction in global growth, global GDP. And in global GDP, not GDP growth, actually of wealth, of 2%. So a 3-month lockdown, which is what the British government is currently saying they're going to implement, will lead to a 6% contraction in global GDP. Now, that's worse than the Great Recession after the 2008 crash, which was about a 5% contraction. An 8-month lockdown will lead to a 16% contraction, which would be worse than the Great Depression that followed the Wall Street crash. And then it's worth thinking about, most of the estimates are saying that a viable vaccine is unlikely to be available. This may or may not be true, but a viable vaccine is unlikely to be available for 18 months, according to most of the data that I've seen. So that would mean, on the OECD's statistics, which, like I said, are probably quite conservative, that would be a 36% contraction. So twice as bad as the Great Recession, the Great Depression. So that's quite astonishing kind of impact that this could all have economically. And if, Matt, if you could go to the next slide for me, please. Yeah, so basically the position that governments are in is that they are being required for public health reasons, or being pressured for public health reasons, to flatten the curve. So I'm sure people have seen this graph, that taking robust public health measures means that the peak of infections is pushed back and the total number of deaths and infections is reduced. But the problem is, from the perspective of governments around the world, that the more you do that, the greater the economic fallout. So they're faced with a choice. They can either put the economy first and risk an enormous economic fallout with all of the social consequences that that's going to bring, or they can put the economy first and kill millions of people. And that's the choice that coronavirus is imposing onto governments around the world. Now, if we move to talking about the UK, then the UK government's initial preference was very clearly for sacrificing hundreds of thousands of people at the altar of the capitalist economy. So despite the World Health Organization quite pointedly saying that, and I quote, "allowing uncontrolled spread should not be a choice of any government," that's what WHO said. Despite that, this was exactly the choice that the British government made. The government's initial strategy was to let the virus rip through, and that's the phrase that government figures used, communities, in order to build a kind of so-called herd immunity by getting about 60% of the population infected. Now, with a case fatality rate of 1%, which is at the lower end of estimates of the case fatality rate, i.e., the number of people who contract the disease who end up dying, on that conservative estimate, a case fatality rate of 1%, this would mean 400,000 deaths in Britain. And that, of course, would quickly overwhelm the NHS, which has been decimated by a decade of effective cuts. And so this was their initial strategy, which is really quite amazing. But it slowly dawned on the government that the population was unlikely to just sit back and allow tens of thousands of people to die. The government were risking an enormous backlash, political, social backlash, if they went along with this. And so they slowly started to change tack. And so a full 6 weeks after the first case was detected in the UK, so this was on the 15th of March, 6 weeks after the first case, the health secretary, Matt Hancock, let slip to a journalist. So this wasn't officially announced. He accidentally ineptly let slip to a journalist that the government was going to ask over 70s to self-isolate. Working age people were to continue going to work. So the government hoped that this would resolve that contradiction for them between public health and the needs of the economy. You can warehouse the elderly people who are vulnerable in their houses, and who cares what happens to them? And the people who go out making profits for the capitalists continue to go and do that. And then it wasn't until a week after that, so the clock is ticking down in terms of coming in hard and fast to take effective action to flatten the curve. A full week after that, so 7 weeks after the first case was confirmed in Britain, the government announced a lockdown. And of course, this lockdown isn't really any such thing. You can go on The Guardian, you can go on The Independent, you can go on The Telegraph, you can go on social media, and you will find dozens of stories of workers in warehouses, building sites, places that are by no stretch of the imagination essential work, like providing food or providing healthcare in current circumstances, being forced to continue to go to work through this public health crisis. So the lockdown isn't really any such thing. And like the lockdown, the government's more sort of directly medical response has been utterly shambolic as well. So despite government estimates putting the need for ventilators at 30,000, and where the country only currently has 8,000, the government have seemingly taken no action to procure enough ventilators. They have repeatedly snubbed companies offering to supply them, and they failed to respond in time to an EU scheme to jointly source ventilators for European countries. And they seem to only be interested in offers from British companies. So there was a very interesting article in the Financial Times about a week ago where the FT interviewed people that work for companies that supply ventilators, who'd put offers in to supply them to the government and so on. And basically, the article reported on a proposal that could have supplied the NHS with as many as 25,000 ventilators from China. So that would have closed the gap of what the government says it needs, that they just didn't bother to answer. And it's still sitting on some Whitehall bureaucrat's desk. And actually now I think the deadline for responding has passed. And so in the midst of this public health crisis, the government are not putting aside their kind of nationalist politics. They're not putting aside the question of the competitive future of British imperialism for a single second. They're only interested in sourcing British ventilators, which I'm sure are much, obviously are going to be much more efficient at saving lives for some God-known reason. And so it was in the news yesterday that the first batch of 30, which is manufactured by a consortium of British manufacturers, is apparently going to appear this weekend. That's 30, which is 1/1000th of what is needed. But from the government's perspective, at least they're British ventilators. Alongside this, doctors and medical personnel across Britain are still not being issued with adequate personal protective equipment. And as I said, people that speak out about this are being threatened. NHS workers are being gagged. You can read about this in the mainstream press. Additionally, this week, one of the ministers in the government, Michael Gove, was caught lying about the number of tests that have been carried out. He claimed that tests were not being done because of a shortage of chemical reagents that are needed for the test. But according to the Chemical Industries Association, which is the trade body for chemical manufacturers, there is no shortage of these chemical reagents. So it's worth reflecting on the fact that Germany, in many ways a similar country to Britain, a European imperialist country, is performing 70,000 tests a day, whereas Britain has not yet hit the 10,000 a day mark, despite this being the government's objective. So, and if people are interested, I can talk later if people want to know about why Britain hasn't managed to do those tests. But the point is that this absolutely callous disregard for the lives of the working class could not be more starkly contrasted with the decisive action that has been taken to protect the capitalist economy. So on the 17th of March, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, committed to spending £350 billion, which is 15% of GDP, to prop up businesses via the banks. And 330 billion of this is loan guarantees for businesses. And that includes a £200 billion scheme under which the Bank of England will underwrite the loans of businesses in order to try to encourage businesses to borrow in order to stay in operation. And on the 19th of March, the Bank of England lowered the base interest rate to 0.1%, which is the lowest interest rate in British history, in a further attempt to encourage businesses to borrow in order to stay afloat. So they're trying to encourage businesses to borrow and saying, we will underwrite those loans so that you're not left holding all of this debt, in theory. But the flip side of that is they've also got to encourage the people that have the money to lend. So to encourage banks and financial corporations to lend, the Bank of England announced on the same day that it would print an additional £200 billion to buy UK government bonds. So what this means, in essence, I'm not going to go into the technical detail, but the Bank of England is handing £200 billion to the banks in cash to ensure that they continue lending, is essentially what they're doing. And all of this, combined with another £60 billion that's been announced in the last week or so, amounts to an intervention of over £600 billion. And that's 100 billion more than what followed the 2008 crash. So they're not pulling any punches here. And Rishi Sunak's mantra about this is whatever it takes. They will do whatever it takes to shore up the capitalist economy as far as they can in current circumstances. And so then, what about the much touted measures to help workers? Well, the government is offering too little and too late, and it's been coming in dribs and drabs. So they've announced a mortgage holiday for homeowners, but there's no rent holiday. So you don't have to pay your mortgage for 3 months, but renters, many of whom have been thrown out of work, will continue to have to pay their rents. On the 20th of March, the Chancellor announced that government grants will cover 80% of people who are unable to work, but who companies choose to keep on the payroll. So it's up to companies. The government isn't directly paying people. They're using the PAYE taxation system to allow companies to continue to pay if the companies wish to, and then paying the companies back. And so it's completely at the whim of employers whether they want to take up this scheme, and many of them haven't. Weatherspoons is a good example that's been in the news. Sports Direct, I think, as well. There was a hotel chain, I think it's Britannia. And this will also not help the thousands of workers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands likely, I'll come on to, who have been laid off as companies react to plummeting revenues, particularly in hospitality and entertainment. And these workers will have to claim universal credit, which, according to some reports, isn't actually accepting new applicants. They've also basically condemned many people who are self-employed, which includes in reality lots of gig economy workers, to the same fate of having to apply for universal credit, which is completely inadequate and may not even be taking applications. And if we go to the next slide, this graph gives you an indication of the extent of people being thrown out of work. So in the 2 weeks, so this chart now actually is slightly out of date, because it says that, you know, in the last short periods, about what does it say? About sort of 500,000 people have claimed universal credit. Well, since then, that's now climbed to 950,000 new claimants. So in the 2 weeks from March the 16th to the end of March, 950,000 people claimed universal credit. And you can see the massive spike on the graph. Interestingly, if we go to the next slide, this is a situation that's mirrored in other so-called advanced economies, the imperialist countries. That graph looks remarkably similar. It's unemployment insurance claims, new claims in the United States, which skyrocketed to 3.5 million new claims last week. So that indicates that loads of people are being thrown out of work and are being left to fend for themselves or try to apply for these totally inadequate benefits. So basically, the result of all this is that an unknown number of thousands of people are to be saddled with an early death, thanks to the government's response. Many thousands more are to be plunged into destitution. That's what the government is imposing on the working class in Britain. And of course, it's much worse for different sections of the working class. So the impact this is having on the homeless, on asylum seekers who don't have the right to work anyway or to claim public funds is obviously massively exacerbated. Mostly women who live with abusive partners, all of these kinds of problems. But the point is that you may ask, why are they taking these measures at all? If they were so callous and didn't care about the working class at all, why not do it properly? You know, they're willing to spend all this money, so why not spend the money? Well, the point is that the measures are enough for what they're interested in doing. They want to spend enough money to see a big enough proportion of the working class through. And this might seem like a contradiction, but it makes sense when you consider what the government's motivation actually is. And we in the RCG are very clear. The programme laid out by the government has as its sole aim to defend the wealth and power of the ruling class. That's what they're interested in doing. So first of all, that means stepping in to shore up the banks and the corporations. They don't care about these small and medium businesses, really. They want to shore up the banks, the corporations, in order to let the capitalist economy hang on. Second, securing their wealth and power means taking steps which will allow enough people to get by to limit the size and scope of the resistance to what is being imposed on people that is inevitably going to emerge. The government understands very well the misery and devastation that it is unleashing on the working class from its completely, not just inadequate response, but a response that is targeted at securing the interests of the ruling class. And they know that that misery is going to breed resistance. So the steps that they have taken to provide a lifeline to many workers are designed to head off that resistance, to make it just about livable for enough people. So I want to address here an argument that comes up sometimes. You might have heard some people on the left in Britain say that the government's economic intervention proves that Corbyn and the Labour Party have, and this is a phrase that has been used a lot, won the argument over public spending. So the fact that the government has finally found the fabled magic money tree now supposedly shows that a Corbyn government would have had little trouble lavishing gifts on the working class under non-pandemic conditions. So here we are. I've got 3 or 4 slides of examples of this kind of argument being put forward. So if you cycle through 1 or 2 more, Matt. Yeah. And then I've got the next one is Corbyn himself. Coronavirus proves that Labour was right about public spending. This is the argument that's being put across. But in reality, this is either naive beyond belief or it is designed to mislead us. In different circumstances, it might be one or the other. But the truth is that the massive expansion of spending that has gone on has only been allowed because of whose interests it serves, the ruling classes. So under extraordinary circumstances where their own interests and their own class power are on the line, the ruling class will take whatever measures it deems necessary. So during World War II, extraordinary measures were taken to direct production, ration food, and so on. In 2008, faced with the threat of a depression, British financial institutions were bailed out to the tune of £500 billion. So desperate times may call for desperate measures, but the ruling class's desperation is only to defend itself. If the best way to head off resistance from the working class being subjected to a pandemic combined with a depression is to pay some wages for now and then claw the money back through another decade of punishing austerity like after 2008, then so be it. They'll do it. And thirdly, securing the ruling class's position means using the opportunity presented by the crisis to bring in new repressive legislation, which will be used to clamp down on any resistance, both during the pandemic and after it is over. And that's really what these extra police powers are in a large part about. So I want to move on now and talk about, if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about a very different kind of response, the response of socialist Cuba. And that response is in marked contrast to that of Britain. So people may or may not be aware that Cuba's public health system is world renowned. So Cuba is a blockaded country. It loses $12 million a day in trade and revenue thanks to genocide imposed on it by the world's biggest imperialist country. Until the late 1950s, it was a neo-colony of the United States whose economic development was completely stunted by its relationship. And it's still a poor country thanks to the blockade and thanks to that history of violence. But Cuba gets better health than the United States for a fraction of the money, thanks to its free and universal healthcare system, which seeks prevention over cure, and which has a network of family doctors who are responsible for community health and live among their patients. So right now, unlike Britain, healthcare personnel in Cuba are conducting door-to-door health checks, testing, contact tracing, quarantining, and establishing a registry of those with underlying health conditions who may need additional attention. And that is in marked contrast to Britain. Britain, which squandered 2 months doing precisely nothing. Unlike that, Cuba took decisive preparatory action. So this is quite an astonishing fact. Before a single case of COVID-19 had been detected in Cuba, So they hadn't yet had any cases of the disease themselves yet. Family doctors, tourism and customs officials had already been trained to monitor travelers at ports and airports, screen patients with respiratory symptoms, set up specialized care facilities, and generate public service announcements and daily updates through a kind of health professional app that is used by healthcare institutions and thousands of medics across the island. Cuban health workers returning from solidarity brigades abroad are also monitored, receiving visits by their family doctors in their neighborhood during the first 14 days after arrival. And as soon as case numbers began to climb in March, Cuba closed its borders to non-resident foreigners in order to control the outbreak. And all travelers arriving from high-risk countries or those with flu-like symptoms were monitored for 14 days. So closing the borders may not sound like a big thing. It's what a lot of countries have effectively done. But for Cuba, it's enormous. Cuba is a poor country that is reliant, partially reliant, gets a lot of its national income, that it foreign currency reserves and so on, through tourism, which is one of the few industries it can sort of operate on an international basis thanks to the blockade. And even in those circumstances, they took this step without hesitation, to put public health first, which is quite incredible, considering that they're in a much worse economic situation, being an underdeveloped country, than is Britain, one of the richest countries in the world. So they've also sent medical brigades to countries affected by coronavirus. The medical brigade of 53 doctors sent to Italy is the country's sixth such recent mission. Cuba has sent COVID-19 medical teams to Jamaica, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Suriname, and Grenada. It's also sending coronavirus-trained doctors to the 59 countries where Cuba is already providing medical assistance from before the coronavirus pandemic through its program of medical internationalism. If we move to the next slide. So this was in the news, and actually Dominic Raab actually had to thank Cuba. In Parliament, Cuba allowed the British cruise ship MS Braemar with dozens of infected passengers. So this was, I believe, when Cuba didn't have any cases of its own. It allowed the cruise ship to dock at Mariel Port after it was turned away by the US and by several Caribbean countries, and people received treatment. And this picture is British. I think they're British staff on the cruise ship, saying, we love you, Cuba," because of what the healthcare that they received after being turned away by a number of other countries, including the richest country in the world, the United States, where the president has bragged about how the US is going to just COVID-19 will disappear like a miracle, all of this stuff. So Cuba has also developed an antiviral drug, interferon alpha 2b, which boosts the immune system and appears to have some effect in treating coronavirus. It's also working on a vaccine right now and is therefore at the cutting edge alongside much richer countries that are much better resourced for biomedical research, such as the United States and Britain, both of which are currently working on vaccines, or private companies based in which say they're working on vaccines. So why then? Why has this Caribbean island nation, which until 61 years ago was a sugar colony of the United States and which is subjected to a genocidal blockade by the world's largest imperialist power, why has Cuba not only been able to put the richest countries in the world, with the exception of China, to shame in its containment efforts, but also able to lead the world developing effective treatments and send solidarity brigades of medics around the world, while also securing a robust public health response for their own population? The answer is socialism. Political power in Cuba rests in the hands of the population, and not in the hands of a grasping ruling class more concerned with defending the parasitic and decaying capitalist system. So I'll make my final comments now before we move on to questions. I just want to return to the points I made in the first or second slide about the OECD predictions. If Matt could take us back to that slide. Thank you. So I mentioned that based on OECD predictions, 3 months of lockdown could spell, or would spell in their model, a greater contraction in GDP than the Great Recession that followed the 2008 crash. So, as I've already said, following that crash, millions of people were thrown out of work and a decade of austerity was unleashed, not just in Britain, in lots of countries around the world, in Europe, the United States, and so on. But importantly, in response, movements of people emerged against austerity, and protest movements around the world began to question capitalism itself. In response to what they were being subjected to by this crisis that people, working class people, did not cause. Um, as I also said earlier on the OECD's model, 8 months of lockdown would lead to a 16% contraction, which is worse than the Great Depression. So, what happened during the Depression? Millions of people were thrown out of work as the capitalist economy ground to a halt, and they were thrown into abject poverty. And in response, people around the world began to organize, both as part of the socialist movement and as part of the fascist movement. The Labour government in Britain set up work camps for the unemployed to try to stifle this resistance. And in Germany and Italy, millions of workers fought back and organised against the conditions that were imposed on them. And in both of those countries, the ruling class did, as I was saying it would, what it needed to do to defend its wealth and power. It stood aside and allowed fascism into power in order to smash the workers' movement. So the stakes are pretty high in what we're talking about. And we should make no mistake, the coronavirus may herald a cataclysmic crisis for the capitalist system. And that's on top of the devastating human consequences that are resulting from capitalism's inability to meet the public health response that is needed in response to this disease. So if we go to my last slide, I'll end with a quote from Che Guevara and then a couple of comments about it. So Che said, Cuban revolutionary Che, a doctor, incidentally, by training, he said, "The life of a single human being is worth more than all the property of the richest men on earth." And I think this sums up with crystal clarity the choice that the working class around the world faces. So the capitalist class, the ruling class, views human life with utter contempt. What are millions of dead in the face of tumbling stock prices? They've proven time and again that they will happily sacrifice millions of lives to defend their wealth and power. From the carnage of World War I, when they sent millions of workers to their deaths in a fight over colonies and markets, to the everyday horrors of a system where millions of the poor around the world die every year of curable diseases because there's no profit to be made in treating them. There is no reason why their attitude would change now in the face of coronavirus. So the question facing us is, what is worth more to us, human life or the riches of the capitalist class? Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much for that, James. Just give me a second and I'll take down the presentation. So yeah, I'll just do that now. But we're now going to be moving into a question and answer portion of the meeting today. But before we start with the questions, I'd just like to remind everyone that now we have PDF subscriptions to Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism available, and that's a great way to read more about the Cuban response, more about the British response to the crisis, and a great way to support the Revolutionary Communist Group and help us build an anti-imperialist, anti-racist movement in Nottingham and around Britain. And I think Lee has asked a question, and I was thinking about it as well, James. Could Could you go into a bit more about the testing issues? Why hasn't the British government started mass testing yet? Because it seems to me that what you were saying, like I don't know, yeah. Could you address that, please?
Yes. So I was a little bit stumped by this myself. I couldn't quite work it out because I mean I think there's two things going on. I think that the government response is in one sense very deliberate. They know what their priorities are, and dealing with the public health response in a way that prioritizes the lives of the working class is not their priority. So it's deliberate in that sense, but they're also quite inept. I thought maybe at first it was a question of ineptitude, but then I read an interesting article in the Guardian that somebody pointed me to by Paul Hunter, who's a professor of medicine at the University of East Anglia, and this was a couple of days ago. He basically said, and I think this makes a lot of sense, that the government's initial strategy to build up herd immunity means that they made no preparations. So at that time, they didn't want to interrupt the capitalist economy. They didn't want to disrupt. They thought Britain will remain open for business, I think was a phrase one of them used. And so they didn't make any preparations, whereas other governments were making preparations. And so they bought up the global supply of testing materials. Because there's a global market for these things, and so when eventually the UK decided to move, it was back of the queue. And so the government, I would say now, they're not going to admit that, because that makes it evident that their strategy of allowing this to just rip through the population was completely callous. They still claim that it was the best scientific strategy based on the information at the time, but it wasn't at all. The other point that Hunter points to is that over the past 20 years, the number of laboratories and testing facilities has actually shrunk. So the Public Health Laboratory Service, which is a network of laboratories that was established as part of the NHS in 1946, was subsumed by the Health Protection Agency in 2003, and lots of the laboratories were shut down, taken over by local hospitals, or merged into smaller regional laboratories. So we don't have the laboratory infrastructure, and the government didn't move fast enough because it just wasn't their priority. And now they don't want to admit that. So I would think that just about covers that.
Yeah, thanks. I think that does go a long way to explaining the current situation, and also shows the massive total lack of foresight from the people who have all the power in our society. Um, it's funny that you said the science didn't change. A lot of the bourgeois media totally supported the government's claim that the science just changed on one day. I think it was a Tuesday. It's just, oh, science has changed its mind now, which is very convenient for the government. Becky has raised a related point in the comments on Facebook. They've asked, what about the billions put into the economy by the government? What was that for? Was that just a waste, as now economic crash seems inevitable? So yeah, what is the role of these bailouts, and are they going to be effective?
So whether they're going to be effective remains to be seen. I mean, I think Becky makes a good point. You can't just throw money at something that is a structural crisis. The government likes to present and bourgeois economists like to present what's happened as something completely out of nowhere. So a lot of the financial press is referring to a black swan event, which is this theory by this guy called Nicholas Taleb, which is basically about how it's something that we couldn't possibly have known this was going to happen. This recession has just been thrust on us by a completely external problem, the coronavirus. But that's not true. The British economy posted before the impact of coronavirus. Arguably, coronavirus had some impact on the supply chains and things because it had already had an impact in China. But really, before coronavirus had any impact, the British economy posted zero growth in January. So we were already in recession. So, in that sense, yeah, it might not work. But what they're trying to do is they face a real problem of businesses have got lots of debts to service. Businesses have got cash flow issues. So if businesses are going to continue paying, their day-to-day costs, wages and rents and blah blah blah, they need cash. And at the moment, they don't have it. So the government is trying to throw cash at the problem in order to shore up the businesses, but they're also trying to shore up the kind of big institutional investors. So they're not faced with a cash flow problem in the same way. They're faced with a fear about what's called the liquidity of assets. So, what in sort of normal conditions, in scare quotes, um, investors will invest in all kinds of things that they expect to get some kind of return out of. But when everything's going to shit, they want they want one of two things. They want either very, very secure assets like government bonds, or they want cash, because cash is, you can spend it on whatever. And they were basically holding lots and lots of debts and lots of assets. They were holding government bonds that meant they didn't have cash. And because of how fragile the UK economy is, because it's so dependent on its overseas financial earnings, a lot of investors were worried about basically being saddled with a load of useless government bonds, because if the UK government becomes financially insolvent, they don't pay back the interest on the bonds. So the government basically said, we'll buy the bonds off you. The Bank of England said, we'll buy the bonds off you, and then you can have cash. So they're basically saying to the investors, it is okay, you should keep your money here. So there's a number of different things going on. Whether it works, I mean, quite possibly not, because there's a, what is it? Karl Marx said. He said there's a really famous, really good quote. He said, "Any child knows that a nation which stopped producing, I will not say for a year, I will say for 2 weeks, will perish." And all of this, financial stuff is speculating on production essentially, and production is grinding to a halt. So wealth isn't being produced, and that's becoming apparent to people. So you're not going to speculate on getting your cut of future wealth that is produced if you don't expect wealth to be produced in the future. So it may not work, but all of this capital, it's not really clear where else it's going to go. I mean, maybe the US, but the US faces the same problem, and maybe China, which is possibly seeing an economic recovery. But there's only a limited amount of investment that China can take. So there may not be a way out if the depression that's going to come is as bad as what is being projected. Does that answer the question?
Um, I believe so, but if Becky could let us know if that answered the question, that would be good. Quite a lot of people have been commenting about on our Facebook. So just a reminder, if you've got any questions or thoughts, pop them in our Facebook. People have been raising how the issues around the pandemic and the lockdown are basically, heightening the contradictions and exacerbating the problems faced by some of the most oppressed people in Britain. So Annie has said, I just wanted to raise the plight of thousands of people who are detained because of Britain's racist immigration laws. A few people have been released, but indefinite detention is barbaric at the best of times, keeping people confined with no possibility of self-isolation. And JJ has agreed with that and talked more about the rest of the prison system, saying that prisoners with symptoms of the virus are not being isolated and are being kept with asymptomatic prisoners. And apparently in Wandsworth prison they don't even have hot water. So this is the British state, killing people through negligence.
And I think I read the other day that apparently the first cases have been found at Yarlswood Detention Centre, where women migrants and their children are detained indefinitely.
Another a similar point has been raised that by Tom out over on Facebook. Tom has said one really important issue in the current situation is the impact on domestic violence. I have a friend who works for a local support organisation. They are really inundated with people needing support, worse than any time in the last 10 years. So, and this is in the context of massive cuts to refuges. So we really are seeing like you mentioned in the Great Depression in the 30s, it really brought out the absolute worst aspects of the capitalist system, and we are beginning to see that. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it's a different point, but I think, yeah, all of those points about the way this is going to impact on different sections of the working class quite differently, are all very important. But it's also, in terms of exacerbating these contradictions and so on within the capitalist system, I think it's an interesting angle on this of what's going on is that, that a lot of the financial press, which, is you can use as a kind of proxy for what the ruling class is worried about, is really worried that this is going to, and already is, spurring a rise in nationalism. This is going to spell the end of globalization, and they're saying, oh no, they're putting out all these pleas to safeguard globalization. But the crisis is making it clear again that the world is divided into separate and potentially hostile powers. So in good times, the capitalist powers will by and large cooperate with each other because that's the best way to secure the interests of their national capitals. But in a crisis situation, what we've seen time and time again is that they won't do that. Um, and we're already seeing that the major powers are not wasting an opportunity to pursue their own national interests at the expense of the rest of the world. So I suppose people might have seen this thing about 2 or 3 weeks ago where Donald Trump offered to buy the vaccine rights from German company CureVac for a coronavirus vaccine that it was developing, and basically saying that the US will have that we want this. We'll have a coronavirus vaccine. The US has taken this opportunity to designate the elected president of Venezuela, the socialist president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, as a narco terrorist. And yesterday, they offered the absolutely disgraceful deal to the Venezuelan government. They said, basically, they've been trying to displace the government in Venezuela for 20 years since they came into power. They've stepped up their efforts majorly over the last 2 or 3 years, and they've imposed massive sanctions on Venezuela, as has Britain. And the sanctions are preventing Venezuela from basically they've crippled the Venezuelan health system and the economy, and they're now preventing Venezuela from dealing adequately with the coronavirus pandemic. And the US government offered to the Venezuelan government to lift the sanctions in exchange for Maduro, the elected president of Venezuela, stepping down. So again, they're doing the same thing to Iran. They're refusing to lift sanctions, and they're only lifting trade. What's the word? Trade tariffs, minor ones for their own reasons, and they're not lifting major tariffs they have because they want to come out of this on top. They want to come out of this crisis on top compared to their rivals. And you can see this in the kind of what I would call a kind of political choreography, a kind of show. So Trump calls it the Chinese virus. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, the government banned flights from Europe, but not from the UK. So they're not wasting this opportunity to pursue a kind of program in their own national self-interest or the interest of the US ruling class. And the US are not alone. Yes, Trump is a racist, and a bigot and all of those things, but he isn't alone. All of the major powers are doing this. In the EU, the EU had already been taking steps to block foreign direct investment into Europe. Before the coronavirus, and now they've taken this opportunity to really highlight the forthcoming screening mechanism that's coming in, to basically block foreign direct investment, and they're aiming to deter takeovers by overseas companies that they say threaten security and public order. And this explicitly includes critical health infrastructures and inputs. And they're taking this opportunity too to put up the barriers and say, no, Europe is going to look out for Europe, not allow the US to come out on top. And then, of course, there's the UK. Preference for sourcing, the UK government has had this preference for sourcing British ventilators, which is obviously batshit. And they're also refusing to postpone Brexit negotiations. So if you think about what Brexit is, the whole dispute is about British imperialism. The section of the British ruling class wants Britain to go it alone as an independent imperialist power. And so, but that's not really possible. That's the kind of fantasy that they have. And in reality, it means making a choice between siding with the EU imperialist bloc or with the United States. But this is all being presented in this kind of independent Britain, global Britain, all of this. And the UK is refusing to postpone Brexit negotiations in the middle of what is going to be a depression and a pandemic. So, there are these tensions going on all of the time. And these inter-imperialist rivalries are going to sharpen even further as the depression and the pandemic worsen.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people have been raising in the comments. Iftikhar mentioned that a lot of powers have been, claiming that each other has developed this as a bioweapon. Russia has claimed that the US made it as a bioweapon, and the US have obviously claimed that it's come out of a Chinese lab. So, and that's just one aspect of their battle against each other. And Tom has pointed out, as you mentioned, that these rivalries have been endemic for years. So I think, and also I didn't know this. Anime has said on YouTube that the Labour Party has been supporting this new drive for regime change. Specifically, Emily Thornberry has been supporting this US attempt to establish a junta in Venezuela. And so this is this is the democracy of the international rules-based order that we hear so much about. I wanted to move on to something slightly different. So CEO Hannah was asking what the RCG thinks the next steps are in the current period, and Ted has asked a very similar question about how, I don't have the wording in front of me, sorry Ted, but how can communists and socialists win over the newly lumpenized and or proletarianized sections of people that are being generated by this crisis?
Sorry, could you repeat the two questions again?
So it's basically how can we respond to this? What should our next steps be? And Ted specifically said, how can socialists or communists win over the people who will be proletarianized in this crisis?
Yeah, okay. I mean, so yeah, there's a number of quite obvious demands that people need to agitate around. So people can find on our Facebook page, we've got a number of those demands. Sorry, my thing isn't working. We've got a number of those demands, program of mass testing, providing economic security that makes social distancing possible, lifting sanctions against underdeveloped countries under sanctions, and so on. And I think those things are very important. And yeah, we have to be very clear about what's actually needed. But I would say that the demands themselves, in and of themselves, are they're important, but they're not enough. The The fact of the matter is, as I tried to point to, that even in this situation of a pandemic, people are not going to have much choice at some point but to fight back. We're already, we can see that already in a number of underdeveloped countries where, the levels of police repression that are being meted out against workers in some countries. I saw something, I think it was in the Philippines, and there's stuff in India where, people are going outside to look for work because there is no social security net for them. And they're being met with violence. They're being faced with a choice, about, do you sit around at home and starve to death, or do you go out and risk becoming infected? Well, I think I know which option I would have to go for in those circumstances. Sitting around and starving to death, 100% chance that you don't make it. Case fatality rate 4%. If you're healthy in general, 96% chance you make it. So, at some point, people are going to have to fight back against what's happening. And we don't know when that's going to happen. It could be around any number of things. I mean, there are talk about a rent strike. I don't know whether that's actually happening. But at some point, people will fight back, because that's what people always do. And when they do, that can go in a number of directions, a number of political directions. So, you can imagine a scenario where some sort of right-wing movement capitalizes on people's legitimate problems, and pushes things in that direction. You can imagine a situation where that resistance, this is a more likely outcome in Britain, where that resistance is completely, every effort is made by the most of the British left to shackle that resistance to the Labour Party. It could go in any number of directions, and what's going to matter when it emerges is the kind of leadership that emerges. And so my view is that what we can do is get prepared, get organised now, in order that we're in a position to intervene into those struggles when they emerge, because we don't know when they're going to emerge. But we know that, an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, socialist, communist perspective is the only thing that can resolve the coming crisis. That perspective linked with the resistance that capitalism itself creates by the way it is operating. So that's I think what we need to do. Get prepared, get organized. And in terms of how we win people over, I think I don't think it poses special questions in that sense. I mean, we go out and we get involved in the struggle, and we try to win people over by putting forward our position, by demonstrating that we're on the side of the people who want to see a proper solution. So I'm sorry if that's all a bit sort of vague and general and abstract now, but because that resistance hasn't emerged on a big scale yet, we don't know what form it's going to take, if that helps, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do think that makes a lot of sense. Over on the YouTube, user Angry Bear Sex has been raising a lot of interesting points. They were saying that their brother is sorry, I've scrolled away from it now, but I think an ambulance worker in London, and they were saying that they're almost totally out of masks, and they're now being expected to perform CPR without any masks, and the masks that they have are paper masks and not even N95. So that's just another concrete example of, the criminal negligence of the British state in response to this. And they've also raised the issue of the current security legislation which is being passed and how that's going to affect our ability to organise. And the question is, what impact will that have? Well, I imagine, at the moment we're meant to be locked down, so that will, that curtails the right of protest. But I wondered if you had any more Thoughts on that, James?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that this, you know, we should not be naive to think that this, that these security measures are taken with our interests in mind. And, we should be quite clear that, they know that what they're doing is inadequate, and they know that they're going to face resistance, so that they're tooling themselves up on a legal basis, to justify cracking down when they need to. But as ever, I would point out that law is the law. What matters in the end is the balance of class forces. So they can have all the laws they want, but faced with a strong working class movement, or in a particular situation where they've got a crowd against them or whatever, laws don't necessarily count for all that much. We should not be deterred from doing what has to be done by this increase in repressive measures. If anything, the fact that they're doing this shows that it's how important it is that we organize, and how important it is that we defy these attempts to crack down on our rights to organize, where it's necessary.
Yeah, totally. There have been some questions over on YouTube about what a communist response would look like, and again, and the question of comparing Britain and Cuba. So I'll read out a question from a while ago from a user called Laura. I said, "Hi James, great job with the presentation, really informative. What would a communist response to coronavirus look like in the UK? I think we've spoken about that." And then they raise an interesting concrete issues. So they're saying, we have some info about what Cuba is doing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but closing the borders so quickly is much easier done in Cuba than perhaps it would be in the UK. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about, comparing the border regime in Britain to that of Cuba, and talking a bit about the preparedness of the medical system as well.
The preparedness of the medical system in Cuba or Britain, or both?
Well, say what you want to say, but I guess the massive lack of preparedness in Britain, and the massive, you know, more than prepared to help people all over the world in Cuba. It sort of speaks for itself, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, I think a communist response to coronavirus. I mean, obviously, you can never say that what Cuba has done is what a socialist Britain would do, because the different countries and blah blah blah. But Cuba has shown what a communist response um, to the coronavirus is. The fact that their preparation is not that they realized a month earlier than everybody else that they needed to make preparations because they're quite switched on, and so they made the preparations when other countries were putting the interests of capitalists first. They have a whole setup. They spend 51% of their state budget on health and education. During the special period in the 1990s, when, for reasons out of Cuba's control, they lost their major trading partner, the USSR, and then that basically massively exacerbated the blockade that they live under. Their GDP contracted by, I can't remember, something like 20%, which is what yeah, it's quite an astonishing amount. They didn't close a single hospital, and they didn't close a single school during that period. Like I said, the Great Recession, caused a 6% global drop in GDP, but in Britain it was a couple of percent. I can't remember the exact figures. It might have been 3 or 4, something like that. And think about the decade of austerity that was unleashed on people. The Cubans are so clear about the health of the population is a priority, and so their preparation is 60 years of a healthcare system that is targeted towards actually improving people's health and preventing disease and all of these things, and not the kind of healthcare system we have, which for all its great aspects. The NHS is an important concession that's been won from the ruling class. He's not geared up towards actually dealing with people's health problems, because it can only, by its very nature, be a kind of curative system that deals with disease. So there's all these elements about Cuban socialism that go into their preparation. In terms of what a communist response to the coronavirus in Britain might be. I mean, it's about putting the working class and that means internationally first. So, Britain is one of the richest countries in the world. If Cuba can send doctors around the world to dozens of countries, which they've been doing since 1962, I think, or it might be 1960 even. Yes, it is. It's 1960. They sent doctors
Yeah.
in a situation where over half of the doctors left after the revolution. So they went down from something like no, I can't remember the figures, but they had very, very few doctors, and even in those circumstances, they sent something like 30 doctors to Chile to assist with with the earthquake. So if Cuba can do that as a poor blockaded country, Britain, which is the fifth or sixth richest country in the world, having plundered the rest of the world for centuries, think what Britain could do. If we had a political system like Cuba's, and that's something that we need to fight for. Internally as well. There would be no reason why we couldn't effectively quarantine, contact trace, test. Because yes, Britain is a larger country, and so the resources for testing might be more difficult. But if you look at a country like South Korea, for example, which hasn't had a testing program on the scale that some other countries are embarking on, what they have effectively done is contact tracing, and Vietnam has done the same with limited resources. And the reason is that that the state has this real kind of commanding, has this ability to really kind of step in. Whereas if you take Boris Johnson's excuse for his actions is because he's trying to defend people's liberties, because part of this kind of way that they put their capitalist politics forward is that the liberty of individuals should not be trampled on. If you're ruling class, if you're of the working class, your liberties can be trampled on left, right, and centre. But there was an amazing quote from Boris Johnson when he announced the lockdown. He said, I can't remember exactly how he put it, but that he didn't want to trample on the ancient, inalienable right of freeborn Britons to go to the pub. Is an actual line that came out of Boris Johnson's mouth. So that unwillingness to kind of let me try and put this a different way. That individualism at the heart of our society really mitigates against taking the kind of actions that are necessary, especially when the government we have in power doesn't really have any interest in doing that for the reasons that I've outlined. In terms of the question about the borders, clearly the issue of borders is a very different issue in Cuba and Britain. So what does Britain's system of border controls defend? It defends this brutal, parasitic capitalism. So Britain's foreign financial assets are 6 or 7 times its GDP. Britain sucks in wealth from all around the world. Britain has basically no borders for rich people, and it has no borders for capital. Capital can flow in all around the world. Money can flow in all around the world to the City of London. But what can't flow in is people who are forced to move or choose to move, whatever, because of the conditions that imperialism imposes onto them. So Britain's border controls exist to defend that, basic, that parasitic, decaying capitalist system. Cuba's border controls are of a different order. They exist to defend the gains of socialism, which Cuba shares with the world by sending round its medics. Britain has taken some steps towards closing its borders in terms of for people, but it's not taking the steps to close its borders to capital. It's not. And it's also, how are they going to react to this situation where the workers who they need to work in the fields, picking food in Britain, they're totally reliant on Eastern European workers. And they're faced with this real problem now, where Eastern European workers aren't coming. And so, what are they going to do? They may well not close the borders in that sense. So, I hope that is a useful response to the question.
Yeah, no, I do think it is. I think I saw something about uh, drafting in some Eastern European workers to like pick some fruit during the crisis because it's so unthinkable that British capitalism could function without the super exploitation. Um, yeah, so just on Cuba, we've had a lot of discussion on Cuba in the chat of why Despine mentioned the stuff. I believe you raised it, James, briefly about we face a potential economic contraction now, and in the special period in Cuba, they faced a massive 30% economic contraction, but still managed to meet the needs of their people. And Che has mentioned, I assume that's not the Che, I should assume that's someone else, has mentioned that this solidarity internationally from Cuba is not a new thing. They tried to help the people who were suffering from Hurricane Katrina, but they were refused to do this by the Bush administration. And a nice summary over on YouTube from user Angry Bear Sex again has said in Cuba it's hard to get hold of an iPad thanks to the blockade, but also their neighborhood and government won't let your nan die to ensure billionaires don't drop down to millionaires, which I think is a very good way of phrasing it. Um, Over on Facebook, we've had a slightly different issue raised by Lee, and they're saying, I think it's relevant to bring up that the development of a lot of new pathogens come partially as a result of capitalism going out and screwing with ecosystems and biomes in an exploitative but cheap way. I assume they mean cheap from the perspective of the capitalist. EcoHealth Alliance, I don't know who they are, but they did a study saying that new pathogen emergence is linked directly to human-induced drivers like land use change and interactions between humans and wildlife in highly biodiverse regions. Under capitalism, it's all about doing whatever's most profitable, and look at the results. And I saw another bit of journalism that was saying that human bats like interactions have been massively increased in places like Indonesia due to deforestation. It's putting the bats into close contact with the humans. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on those issues.
Yes, I definitely do. Before I go on to that, I just sort of realised I hadn't really drawn out the main point about that comparison between Cuba and Britain. I think what I didn't really stress, which I did stress in the original introduction, was that the difference between Cuba and Britain is what matters. It's not that Cuba's adopted better policies. Cuba is a socialist country where there's the working class is in power, and that's the difference. So what a socialist Britain in the future after a socialist revolution might do in similar circumstances is an interesting question. But the point is, of course, that we don't live in a socialist country. We do not have the power in this country, and that is why the people who have the power and who have different set of interests are pursuing the path that they're pursuing. They don't care about you and me. They're perfectly happy to see the herd culled, and they've made that clear on a number of occasions. And of course, if we want a different kind of solution, we have to fight for it. That's not really a point I drew out. I just wanted to sort of make that clear from my comments before, which may have been slightly rambling because they were a bit off the cuff. In terms of the point about the virus and human encroachment, what I'm going to say is drawn almost entirely from the front page article in the latest issue of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, which you should buy a PDF version of if you have not already. And in that article, our comrade who wrote that article, Charles, basically he points out essentially the capitalist origins of the pandemic, and in fact of the virus itself in a lot of ways. So um, it's a zoonotic virus, right? The SARS-CoV-2 virus. So it passes into humans, as the commenter Lee said, when humans encroach on new natural environments and come into contact with species that we hadn't come into contact with before. And what's the main driver of this human encroachment today? Was business. It's capitalist industry, especially agribusiness, so industrialized farming. This industrialized farming encroaches into biodiverse regions and destroys them, displacing all of those creatures and so on that we were talking about, bats and etc. that Matt mentioned. Destroys these regions for monocrop industrial farming of maize, rice, and wheat in particular, but also soy, palm, and other crops. Not content with that and with reducing the biodiversity that way, they then use pesticides to optimize food production and crop yields. They don't do this because there's a need for more food. A third or a half of all food that's produced is thrown away, but they do it because it's profitable to do so, or competitive to do so. And as a result of this, genetically and environmentally homogeneous monoculture develops, which is different to what's found in the natural ecosystems. And this means that specialized pathogens emerge, which are more virulent than their wild ancestors. And this homogeneity, this is basically just quoting from the article, makes pathogen transmission easier, increases pathogen genetic diversity, and increases pathogen mutation. And so all of this basically means that you get even more virulent strains, and the use of pesticides over time kills off the less virulent ones. So you end up with these really strong, really virulent, really aggressive strains of these different microbes. And then the global trade in agricultural products accelerates the movements of these pathogens around the world, which creates which spreads these new pathogens. So in this case, it was the Huanan, I'm probably not saying that right, but seafood market. It contained animals from all around the world that don't normally live together, confined in unsanitary conditions with humans, and all these microbes are just jumping around. These agribusinesses want to expand by bringing another 1.4 billion hectares into use for crop production by 2050. So if capitalism has its way, this is going to get worse. There's already been a number of these zoonotic, major spreads of infection: avian flu, SARS, swine flu. This is the latest one, and they're only going to get more virulent, which is quite quite worrying, and it shows that really the problem is capitalism, rather than this virus just happening to have jumped into humans.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think what you've just said needs to be a key part of the communist response, because this is how we understand that the structural features of capitalism are going to keep us in, they're going to keep recurring these issues. There's been a lot of different comments about how about various things. So Annie has mentioned that there is an idea going around about a pots and pans protest on Saturday night, 6 p.m., demanding proper protective equipment for key workers. And apparently that's inspired by actions that Brazilian protesters are doing. Becky has mentioned that their partner's manager is proposing that they send home all of the trained staff to protect them from the disease. So that sounds good. And then replacing all of these staff with migrant agency workers in the factory. And Becky guesses those people are disposable and their needs are not important. So, this is showing you the totally racist character of British capitalism. Anime has mentioned another issue, which is schools and government communication. So they're saying people are not properly informed by the mainstream press. Workers using the tube are being blamed for spreading the disease, but many of them are still being forced to go to work. and the government's information on who should go to school, who's a key worker, who isn't. None of that has been planned properly, and people who work in their school are worried about the kids are not going to school because some of them already don't get enough food and are already relying on food banks during the holidays, and because of the total lack of planning from the British state, it's going to spell real trauma and suffering.
Absolutely. I think those are all important observations.
Okay, James has asked over on YouTube um, about the sorry, how this is impacting the people in Palestine, who are already under a brutal Israeli occupation. I've seen in Gaza, they have a very, I can't remember the number, they have a very small number of ventilators, and they don't have sanitary conditions at the best of times because the Israeli military has repeatedly bombed their key infrastructure and destroyed their ability to make seawater um, drinkable by humans. So, do you have any comments on the situation in Palestine, James?
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show again, that the response of countries like Cuba shows that there's nothing about this virus that human beings can't meet. The challenge, but the political, economic, social kind of conditions that people are living under are what makes it impossible to deal with it. So I mean, it's the issue with Palestinian healthcare goes back a long time. Thanks to the blockade, cancer patients are routinely denied treatment, including children. Uh, because basically Gaza's hospitals are not really set up to deal with it because of the lack of resources, and they're denied permits to get treatment in Israeli hospitals. This is this is a pre-existing situation when an oppressed people is living under a military occupation, living under a blockade, living under occupation from a power that wants to basically wipe them from the face of the earth. There's no way that the Israeli occupation is going to take the steps necessary to defend the Palestinian people. You can read, if you go to the website of Samadoun, which is a Palestinian political prisoner solidarity organization, and they've got some material about how the prisoners are being treated. They're basically just letting the virus just rip through the prisoner population who are housed separately from the Israeli prisoners, and they're not letting them out. Because again, the Israeli occupation is not going to miss an opportunity to stick the knife in further to the Palestinians. So I know you can find material online. I don't have much more information than what Matt's already said about the lack of ventilators, the lack of material to actually deal with this. But if you might read an article in the Guardian or something that says, "Oh, isn't this terrible? Gaza's under resourced, and so they can't deal with it." No, Gaza is under occupation by Israel, and that's why they can't deal with it. And that occupation, of course, is backed to the hilt by British imperialism because Israel provides a key strategic ally for British imperialism in the Middle East. And the Palestinians, it's a particularly severe example of the position that oppressed nations are being put in by this pandemic.
Yes, totally. And Shelley McDonald has shared on Facebook a article from Plus972, who I've not read this article, but I know they've made a lot of good articles in the past. The title of that is Coronavirus Pandemic Driving Increased Racism Against Indian Jews in Israel. A 28-year-old Indian Jew in Israel is in hospital after being assaulted by Israelis who called him Corona. So that just shows you brutal racism at play, and we're going to see responses like that in countries all over the world, unfortunately. So it's now 7:30, so I think we should be just about ready to wrap up. So I'd like to encourage everyone who's listening to like us on Facebook and YouTube, and there's links coming out now. You can get in touch with us via our email account, which is nottinghamrcg@gmail.com, and subscribe to our mailing list. And you can now purchase PDF copies of the new issue of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, which has analysis of the response to the coronavirus all over the world, and plenty more besides. It's hot off the presses, and yeah. Were there any closing remarks you wanted to make, James?
Yes, there definitely were. I mean, like Matt says, there's a number of things you can do, including getting a subscription to our paper. But more importantly than that, even I would say that I want to just end by saying that sooner or later, people are going to resist because they're not going to have any choice. Like I said, what is being imposed on people already. Those 950,000 extra people who have signed up for universal credit, those women that were referenced who are living with abusive partners, migrants in detention centres. People, working class people across Britain and around the world are not going to have any choice but to resist at some point. We don't know when that's going to happen, or where it's going to happen. But when it does, where that leads depends entirely on the course of the struggle, and what kind of political consciousness and political leadership that struggle develops. And you can be sure that the forces that want to tie any emerging resistance to the completely useless Labour Party, who have rubber stamped the government's entire response, they will emerge and they will do everything they can to try to tie this resistance to what is acceptable to the prejudices of the Labour Party. You can be sure that racist forces, whether the state forces or unofficial forces, will use this and the issues it throws up for working class people to try to direct things in a reactionary direction. But I hope that listening to this, it's shown you that the only response that can actually resolve these problems is to fight for working class power and to fight for socialism. And so it's up to anybody that agrees with that, anybody who wants to see the kind of solution where these pandemics are restricted in the future because we don't have this capitalist agribusiness, and then if they do emerge, dealt with properly, like what socialist Cuba proves is possible. If that's the kind of solution you want, then we agree with you. And you need to get organized. We all need to get organized, and we need to get prepared for when that resistance emerges and get involved to make sure that it does not get driven in the kind of direction that will just lead to further misery and the extension of this rotten virus of the capitalist system. So I'll end on that political point. And I'll just reiterate, please get a sub to the paper. Please donate to our organisation as well if you can, because obviously we have our operating costs in this period, and it's going to be ever more important in the coming crisis to have a fighting organisation. And so please donate. And lastly, if you like what you've heard today, if you want to talk to us about how we can get prepared to fight back, then please do get in touch. You can message the Facebook page, you can email us, you can find all of those details on our various kind of pages, which you obviously know where they are because you're watching on one of them. So that's all I want to say.
Cool. Thanks a lot for that, Seamus. And the last thing I'll say is that the next event we have lined up is on Wednesday the 15th. We're going to be having a educational discussion on the need for communist organisation. And if you're interested in joining us, send us a message. So yeah, that concludes our meeting this evening. Thank you, everybody. I'll be ending the stream shortly.